It's my pleasure to welcome the first speaker in our four-part spring series, At Home in America. Dr. Mary Phipher is a clinical psychologist and widely read author of 6 books, including the best-selling Reviving Ophelia, Another Country, and The Shelter of Each Other. Dr. Phipher received her BA in Cultural Anthropology from the University of California at Berkeley in 1969, and her PhD in Clinical Psychology from the University of Nebraska in 1977. She is the recipient of the American Psychological Association's Presidential Citation and has been a Rockefeller Foundation Scholar in Residence. Dr. Phipher's work combines her training in both psychology and cultural anthropology. Her special area of interest is the impact of American culture on the mental health of its people. Dr. Phipher travels around the world sharing her ideas with community groups, with schools, healthcare professionals, and we are pleased that she is with us in Minneapolis today. The topic of Dr. Phipher's presentation is taken from one of her most recent books, The Middle of Everywhere: The World's Refugees Come to Our Town. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum, Mary Phipher.
Thank you very much. Greetings. It's an honor to be here at the Westminster Town Hall Forum in this very beautiful church in this city of readers. I always think about books when I think about Minneapolis. I'm going to speak today about my book, The Middle of Everywhere: The World's Refugees Come to Our Town. It's a book that looks at how my city, Lincoln, Nebraska, is becoming part of the global culture. Our city is an official refugee resettlement community, which means we have people from all over the world coming in. We have 52 languages now in our public schools, and Lincoln has become, in the last 15 years, Sudanese, Vietnamese, Russian, Afghan, Bosnian, Croatian, Somalian, and so on. Now, I just want to say something about the definition of a refugee. All refugees are legal. There's no such thing as an illegal refugee. It is a legal designation, meaning a person who cannot stay where they are without being in danger of being tortured, imprisoned, and killed. And they are a person in a particular group, and the group must be defined by religion, language, ethnicity, or political party. So at any rate, what's happened in Lincoln is once refugees are adjudicated to be refugees and sent to this country, generally through JFK Airport, they're met at the airport by an INS official who hands them a plane ticket to Lincoln, Nebraska. They have no choice about coming to the US, and they definitely have no choice about coming to Nebraska. In fact, a pretty common thing that happens is when the refugees arrive in our town, they don't know where Nebraska is. They're confused. Sometimes they think they're actually in Alaska, and they look for polar bears and igloos. But many of them have no idea what state they're in or where our state is located. Now, here's how I did the research for this book. I've got a degree in anthropology, too. And from my point of view, this book was the perfect book for me to write because I could study people from all over the world, and not just in the casual way of a tourist, but I could do family therapy, I could help people with their troubled teenagers and so on, and yet go home and sleep in my own bed every night. So it was just a wonderful project for me, given my interests. I spent a year at an elementary school in an ESL classroom, and the children in this classroom, level 1, came in knowing absolutely no English at all. The amazing thing is, by May, they could speak pretty good English. Their language centers were just on. They were in that good critical time. And this is important because by the time these children are speaking good English, their parents, and especially their grandparents, are just barely learning the rudiments of our language. I also spent, the same year actually, some of the time in the high school. And we could talk about that experience all morning. The only thing I would say about it is I entitled that chapter, Mohammed Meets Madonna. And it was just a zone of cultural collisions, one after another. Incredibly interesting space for an anthropologist. I spent a lot of time with the young adults of the refugee community. In many ways, they have the most difficult situation. They're too old to go to school, but they're young enough that they pick up English quickly enough that they end up being responsible for their parents. They end up being the most likely person to drive, to be able to fill out paperwork, to work and support the family financially. And yet, in many cases, they're very ill-equipped to actually deal with American culture. And the example of this I use in the title is, that chapter is entitled, Is There a Marriage Broker in Lincoln? One of the things about many of our refugees, they come from cultures in which there's absolutely no dating. You marry a person chosen for you by your family. You meet that person at most once or twice before the wedding day. And so one of the things that happened to me a lot, I did a lot of work in the factories as kind of a informal labor negotiator or something like this, or I'd help people find cars. And once the young adults started to trust me, almost invariably they would say to me, could you find me a husband, or could you find me a wife? And I'd go, well, no, I can't do that. Although I was tempted, I wanted to every now and then. I could see it happening. And then they would say, well, where are the marriage brokers in Lincoln? I offered everyone I worked with free therapy. I'd come to their house in my old Honda and offer free therapy. Very few people took me up on that. And that's a big story in itself, why refugees don't like therapy. But they would let me take them to the doctor, or take them to the grocery store, or take them and their children to a swimming pool or the park. And so that's how I got to know people, driving them around, being useful, taking them the places they wanted to go. I also started a mental health project called the Thrive Project, which was a group of us psychologists meeting with leaders of each of our refugee communities, the Russian, the Bosnian, the Vietnamese, the Lao, and so on, Latino also. And we were going to explain to them various subtleties of the mental health system in America and talk to them about how Americans handle things like stress and so on. But fortunately, almost immediately we wised up and realized what we really should do with these 2 months that we spent once a week with this group of refugees is listen to how they handle these issues in their culture and learn about how do they handle domestic violence, how do they handle suicide attempts, what do they do when they're despairing, and so on. And so that was the Thrive Project. By far the most valuable thing I did, my husband Jim and myself, was we became what I ended up calling cultural brokers to 3 families. And one of the families was from the Kakuma refugee camp. A lot of times in the news they're called the lost boys of Sudan, or I don't like that. I don't like the word lost, and I don't like the word boys, because most of the people are now men. In our family's case, actually, there was a sister, 3 boys and a sister that came over. And the oldest, Joseph, was 19. He had been 7 when his family was killed. And he had managed to shepherd all of his siblings through horrible civil war, refugee camp in Ethiopia, and finally life in Kenya in the Kakuma camp. We also had befriended a couple from Sierra Leone who had gotten caught up in the war, and Bintu, the wife, calls Sierra Leone the worstest place on earth. And indeed, the year they came to us, and people come, by the way, very quickly after they're traumatized. I mean, when I met Bintu, she still had scars from some of the things that had happened to her. But Amnesty International considered Sierra Leone the worst place on earth. And Mohammed had seen his family killed. Bintu had been captured by the rebels and held for over a year as a wife, and actually had escaped naked when the rebels invaded Freetown on that awful day when they chopped off all the arms and legs of people in Freetown. And then they had lost their children. They'd been kidnapped and sold to the diamond miners in the South. So when I met them, they were really in a very difficult spot. But the last family we befriended is the one I want to tell you a little bit about today, partly because they come from Baghdad, which is a place we're very interested in right now as Americans, and partly because I did the most with them and know them the best. But this was 6 Kurdish sisters and their mother. And they had a very interesting past. The father had worked for the pre-Saddam government. And when Saddam came into power, he killed all the people, like the father in this family. He was killing all their friends. And so the family escaped at night. The men separately from the women, which was important because the women were sent to, first of all, they walked to a camp in Iran, a refugee camp. And this place was a very harsh camp with mullahs who, for example, one thing the mullahs did is if a young woman wore any lipstick, they would break some glass and put it in a handkerchief and rub the lipstick or rouge off with the broken glass. And the girls were made to wear what they called thick black curtains and not allowed to go to school. Well, they were in this camp, the 6 women and their mother, for about a year and a half. And then they escaped. They paid someone, and this person had horses, and they rode to Quetta, which has been in the news quite a bit. It's a Taliban, ex-Taliban center, and it's a hotbed of radicalism, Muslim radicalism now. But they were in Quetta. They had no men to accompany them. So what that meant was they stayed in a little tiny hut, and once a week some aid workers brought them a package of food. And they lived in this little hut with a few reading materials and a radio for 7 years. These beautiful young women lost their teenage years, their young adult years for the most part, just rotting in this hut. And finally they went on a hunger strike. Said they wouldn't eat anymore if they didn't get out of there. And so the aid agency transported them to Islamabad, where they lived a year. They watched some American TV, learned a little bit of English. And I met them in Lincoln, Nebraska, a week after they were flown from Islamabad to Lincoln. And I was interviewing the youngest daughter, Shireen, I call her in the book, at the public schools as part of my work there, and gave her a ride home, gave her my card. And about a week later, she called me up. She's a very enterprising girl, wanted to support her family, very poor as all the refugees are. She called me up, and she'd seen a matchbook with a model on it, and it said, "Send $75 and you can be a supermodel." So she wanted to know, did I think she could be a supermodel, and should she send this money? And of course I said, no, do not send any money. Well, about 2 weeks later, she called me up, and she'd seen an ad to send money and she could become an artist. And she wanted to know if I thought she should send in $100 for art training, and then she was a good artist. She could support her family as an artist. So again, I said, no, don't send any money. And I said, I'm going to come over and start visiting with you and your sisters and your mom. And that's kind of when we got started. I did something very heroic with this family. I taught all 6 daughters how to drive. And boy, that was hard work. One of the daughters, for example, almost killed us before I realized that she thought when you came to an intersection with a stop sign, you were supposed to drive right out exactly under the stop sign. And this same daughter, Mina, had a way of driving whenever we'd pass. I couldn't figure this out for a while, but whenever we'd pass a speed limit sign, she would just either slam on the brakes or just push on the gas. And finally I figured out, she thought you had to be going, if you pass a sign that said 40 miles an hour, you had to be going exactly 40 miles an hour when you passed that sign. So I taught them all to drive. I took them to our Museum of Natural History and showed them dinosaurs. I always take refugees to our Museum of Natural History because so many of them have had no science at all, and they're just absolutely amazed by the concept of evolution and natural history and extinct animals. And then I took them camping on the Platte because, like many refugees, they love the natural world. And of course, we know that a lot of both physical and mental healing come from being around water, being around trees, and so on. But one example of interesting kind of discussions we had with them was before the 2000 election. We were sitting on a loading dock by a coffee shop we have down in the old district of downtown Lincoln. And it was before the Bush-Gore election. And I was telling him how elections work in our country. Of course, it turned out to all be irrelevant. But I was, for heuristic purposes, giving them example of here's what Republicans believe and here's what Democrats believe. And I was kind of overstating. At that time, the divergence wasn't as great quite as it is now. Oh, but I was overstating the differences to explain. And of course, I was telling them how I thought they should vote. But anyway, as I talked to them, their eyes got wider and wider at listening to me. And I knew them well enough to know by then I was scaring them. So I stopped and I asked, what is wrong? What is wrong? And Shireen said to me, if the candidate that you and Jim do not vote for loses, will you be shot? And that had been their experience, that if your candidate lost, you were shot. So I learned a great deal myself, being a cultural broker. And I think that more and more the world is going to need cultural brokers. The Dalai Lama said it very well when he was talking about Tibet. He said, in our globalized world, nobody gets to be left alone anymore. Whether we like it or not, we will be as mixed together as salt and pepper. 1 in 5 children in this country is foreign-born at this point, and those rates are only going to go up in the next decade. And I think the most important people, not only in our culture, but in cultures all over the world, are going to be cultural brokers that connect people to systems, systems to systems, that explain to people dealing with the enormous transitions what the deal is, wherever they need to know what the deal is. And here's just an example as a cultural broker of some of the things I taught refugees. How to walk on snow and ice. Now, you people in Minnesota know how to do that. But when you think about it, that's a complicated set. You learn what kind of shoes to wear. You learn to evaluate different surfaces. You learn this kind of flat-footed walk. Refugees coming from Sudan, not surprisingly, when they go out the first time on ice, they fall down, and they sometimes get pretty badly hurt. How to use escalators, elevators, revolving doors. What to store in a refrigerator. What's the lifespan of Americans? Why I don't beat my children. What to do when a tornado siren calls. The Africans call tornadoes the big winds. What are Band-Aids, sanitary napkins, dental floss, and deodorant? What animals Americans eat and do not eat? What's a buffalo? How to wear socks. Why we shouldn't litter, and how to eat an ice cream cone. These are all a few of the lessons of a cultural broker. Now, the great Minnesota writer Bill Holm, in his book Coming Home Crazy, about his time teaching in China, said something very profound. He said, I may not be an expert on China, but I learned a lot about the United States while I was in China. And that's exactly what I think about my experiences. I'm not even close to being an expert on these 52 different cultures. It was a very steep learning curve just to learn to pronounce people's names properly. At one point, my husband said, I think you know 25 guys named Mohammed. I had a lot of trouble just keeping up with immigration and refugee law, enough history about countries that I wouldn't offend people when I asked them about the wars in their countries, and so on. But what I did learn a lot about is my town. For example, I'd never had to deal much with the INS. I'd never been in public institutions much that dealt with the indigent and the poor. And I'd been driving by factories that ring my town for years, and they were invisible to me. I'd never actually walked into a factory, the killing floor at Alpo or the Telex where they make computer boards and so on. And I went to see all those places as part of my work. And what I concluded from this, actually a refugee said this quote, and I like it, is that America for the refugees is the beauty and the beast. We offer refugees so much, but we're an incredibly difficult place to learn to navigate. For example, let's just take one thing, education. All refugees are given two very different kinds of education when they arrive in our country. One is by the cultural brokers, the teachers, the librarians, the church people that help them. And the other is by television and advertisers. All our refugees are given a television set when they arrive. Supposedly, it's to help them learn English. But what it actually does is teach them shopping. We educate via advertising, and unfortunately to these very vulnerable and innocent, in some ways, newcomers, we teach them all the wrong things about nutrition, about sex, about violence, about what's valuable and important. So one of the common experiences of cultural brokers is going someplace where there's Mountain Dew in the baby bottles instead of milk, or the families are buying expensive, junky toys they've seen advertised on television instead of winter coats and gloves, because they're learning from advertisers what to buy. And advertising in general teaches people, not only refugees, but Americans in general, the exact opposite of what every great religious system in the history of the world has taught people. And so we miseducate from the beginning. We teach refugees what we have taught our own citizens. You're the center of the universe, act impulsively, don't worry about other people, your needs are the only important needs, spend, 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 don't worry about saving, be a consumer, be an addict, that's what's the most fun and rewarding. And not surprisingly, they have no antidotes to this message, and they're quite vulnerable to it. Just one example of that. I went over to a home, and a Muslim man was down on his knees thanking Allah, and he had tears streaming down his face. He was thanking Allah. I have always prayed to you for help. I thank you, Allah, for granting me my wish. I am a rich man now. I will help my family. Well, it turns out he had gotten a magazine sweepstakes in the mail and believed he had won $1 million. So I had to help him up and hand him a rag to dry his tears and say, you are not a millionaire. This is a false promise to you that you will get $1 million if you fill out these papers and so on. So money is a very difficult thing, and time is a very difficult thing in our country. The two things you have to understand to survive in America are time and money. And many countries have such a different view of time than we Americans do. For example, Bintu, coming from Sierra Leone, she, one time I went to pick her up, she had missed church that morning, and she was crying, and she said, I just was starting to understand American time, and now it is daylight savings time. You could tell she just almost could not believe we could throw yet one more hitch into the complicated ways we do time. One Latino man said to me, I have learned when Americans say, I'm taking up too much of your time, I'd better beat it. So they start catching on to how organized we are around time. And another refugee said to me, you Americans have invented stress, and now with globalization, you're exporting it all over the world. When the refugees, one time I was at a refugee party where it was a party where people had been drinking some beer, so they're getting a little wild and unrestrained. Usually the refugees around me were very polite on their absolute best behavior, but one of the things they started doing was goofing off and making fun of Americans. And the main thing they were doing was playing around with their watches and going, oh, I am having a great time, but it is 8 o'clock, I must go now. Or, oh, this food is very good, but I must stop eating because it is 6:30. And just making a joke about how we are so imprisoned to our time. But, of course, we have the other cultural brokers that save the day, teaching people what is good and beautiful in this country and what is toxic and unpleasant and what people need to avoid. And those teachers essentially have the job of helping refugees sort out how to relate to the broader American culture. If we don't help people if you don't make good intentional decisions about how you relate to American culture, you end up rushed, stressed, unhealthy, addicted, and broke. And the refugees need a lot of help with that. They get a great deal of it from the schools. All of the refugees, one of the common denominators is their love of education. The Kakuma orphans, when they come here, say, "We are orphans, but education is our mother and father." There's such a tremendous respect for teachers. And one of the things actually that is kind of sad in the schools is the refugee children come in with such respect for education and learning, and then they crash into American kids for whom some are very respectful, but let's be realistic, a lot aren't. And the refugee kids are absolutely horrified and astounded by how American kids slouch around in class and talk back to teachers and don't respect authority the way they have been taught to respect authority. And the American kids lose an opportunity to get to know children from such different places. Like this one boy, Boris, who's a very interesting story in himself, but he was saying that he had very little interaction with the American kids at the high school. The only thing they wanted from him was how to say swear words in his language. And he kind of foiled them on that. He told them the words for butterfly and rose, and they were running around talking tough and saying those words. And he and his friends thought, of course, this is very funny. But one of the things I really liked about the high school kids was they had such respect for their parents. And for example, many of the students I interviewed, when I would say, "Now that you're in America, what is your dream?" By far the most common answer was, "I want to make money, I want to get a good education so I can buy a house for my mom and dad." Or one young woman, I said, "Would you want to get married in an arranged marriage here? Would you want to find your own husband?" She goes, "I want to have an arranged marriage, and I would never marry anyone who would not want my mom and dad to live with us." The Vietnamese have a tradition that if you even hear someone speak poorly of their parents, you must walk away from that person or you are betraying your own family. So sometimes, to put this in a more positive way, sometimes there is just an enormously good synergy, a good energy created when Americans and people from other countries combine. Like one mother told me that she went to a home to help some an Afghan family. And we have a lot of Afghans who, ironically, not long ago, the husbands were fighting with the US and the Taliban, on the side of the Taliban against the Russians. And they were our last big wave of refugees to come in before 9/11. But it was only women, only widows. And a lot of these women can't read or write, have never worked outside the home, certainly never driven a car, have never even talked to men who weren't in their families, and are very uncomfortable wearing anything but being totally covered. And many of them have 8 or 10 kids, and they have a very short time before they're expected to work and support their children. So they're in a difficult spot. And this one friend of mine took her junior high sons, 2 sons, over, and they picked up the kids from a Afghan family like this and took them to Target to buy them a few school supplies. And she said it was an amazing experience for her sons, that this family full of children, Target was like Disneyland to them. They just walked around, their eyes big as saucers. They admired everything. They didn't touch anything. They just were blown away by the pencils and school supplies and the assortment of, one of the daughters saw a big wall of colored underwear and asked if they were butterflies, if these were pictures of butterflies that people would buy. Anyway, the boys watched this, and the children never asked for anything, but when the mother would buy them a pair of shorts or a pencil box, they would be so grateful and excited. And the mother said after that day, her sons changed, and they stopped being so greedy, that it was a significant turning point in how her boys related to the world. And just one other example from this, from churches. A Brethren minister told me this story, but remember the boy Boris I mentioned who taught swear words to the high school kids? When he came to this country, 2 weeks before he came to this country, He'd seen his father and his grandfather decapitated in his backyard. So he was just an extremely traumatized kid, but he flies into Lincoln, he gets put up in an apartment by Catholic Social Services, and he's in school trying to learn algebra in his third language within a couple weeks. No therapy, no provisions of any kind for his mental health. And this Brethren minister was talking to me, and he said, we did figure out something the refugees really want, and I encourage you to consider this if you're involved with the church. He said, they need services to sort of put to rest their dead, because so many people running have no way to bury their dead, have no way to have any kind of memorial. And so one of the things our churches are starting to do is give children like Boris, families like the Afghan women I talked about, a place to come and have a service and bury their dead. And those services are oftentimes with food and music and just deeply moving for anyone who's involved. Well, my time is running short, and I know you'll ask me questions, so let me end on just one last story. Sidney Crouch said that all of civilization can basically be boiled down to one word, and that word is welcome. And I think that's a profound statement on Crouch's part. So I want to end with a welcome story. One of the refugees I befriended was a young, pregnant Sudanese woman. And she's about 6'2" tall, Pamela, just blue-black. She wore her hair kind of in a top knot, so she was actually about 4 inches taller than she really was because of her hairstyle. And she needed a checkup at the health center, and that's one of those institutions I've learned about. I go to the health center all the time in Lincoln, and it's really a good institution. The nurses are great, and the doctors are great, and it's free to all the refugees. But everybody, as you might not be surprised here, is always overworked. So we go into the health center, we take number 75. Pamela's got on high-top purple Converse tennis shoes and a red and white African dress. She's a very striking woman, especially 7 or 8 months pregnant. So we sit down, and it's kind of fetid, the air in there, from too many people. Especially as we wait, everybody's starting to unravel, and the babies and toddlers are fussing, and their parents are getting grumpy, and the old people are wilting, and I'm starting to be impatient and look at my watch and think, why am I spending this whole afternoon sitting here with Pamela? I could be doing more important work, and I should have just dropped her off and had her call me on my cell phone later. And so anyway, we're sitting, and time is ticking away, and all of a sudden, this little, I think she's probably Lao, toddler, saw Pamela. And you could tell she was like stunned by how Pamela looked. And she kind of toddled over to her. And she was just staring at Pamela. And the force of this little toddler's gaze was so strong that virtually the whole room, which had been pretty loud, just quieted down. And everybody was watching this toddler stare at Pamela. And I, being a kind of a worrier, and I was thinking, this could be an unpleasant experience. I mean, maybe this little girl will hurt Pamela's feelings. I was kind of worried, what will happen next, as were other people. And so we're all watching, I'm not breathing, and all of a sudden this little toddler just gets a great big smile on her face, just a totally big smile, and does this, and blows a kiss at Pamela. And I love this story because I think it's the essence of what we're all dealing with in this country right now. We are constantly meeting the other. There's uneasiness, there's a feeling of, is this person like me? How is it I connect with them? Are we the same? And then with a little bit of patience and work, we can do it. We can find that commonality. And when we do, there's just such joy. There's just this snap of joy that comes to us. And it ends up being deeply rewarding work. So I'll close the speech portion of this event with a quote from my favorite of all refugees, Anne Frank. How wonderful it is that we need not wait another moment to begin to change the world. Thank you very much.